Hello everyone, thank you so much for your patience. I'm super excited for today's episode, and before we dive into our topic of what to expect when running a vulnerability program, I thought I'd introduce myself and the guest speaker. So my name is Stephen Lee. I'm honored to be your host, and just a little bit about the community. We have been around since 2017, and one of the key missions that I've been on is to help connect people and ideas together through sessions like the webinars and the face-to-face meetups we have. So we've been around since 2017, and we have about 3,000 members globally. So that's in Sydney, Singapore, and more recently in Japan. So our guest speaker today, Robin Birtle, is a good friend of mine. He is one of the best communicators in the industry. I saw a little chuckle there, Robin.
Yeah. No pressure then.
No pressure. Yes, no pressure.
Good.
So he's actually been responsible for the secure delivery of web applications for Japanese companies for over 20 years. And he actually is the head of the security control department within the ORIX Corporation. He actually leads these security programs within ORIX globally. Before that, he was working in positions such as IBM, Thomson Reuters, and GE Capital. So I think he brings a unique balance of views from from a global mindset, and also working within a domestic Japanese company as well. And today, Robin's sharing his special lessons learned from running a vulnerability management program, and we'll be talking about why patching is more of a logistical challenge than a technical one, and address these issues which often arise in Japanese companies. So Robin, can you tell the audience, why is today's topic so important for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're jumping ahead a few slides, but patching basically works. And everybody, I imagine, on the call has a responsibility for protecting their environment, protecting data. And one of the things that I think is really important to assume if you're working in security is that a bad actor has already got into your network. The days of just protecting at the boundary are long gone. And whether it's internet-facing servers or internal servers, it's really important that you do everything you can to prevent an attacker succeeding once they're in the network. Start with assuming somebody's there, and what can you do to stop them?
Absolutely. Yeah. So Robin, I'll leave you to drive the rest of the presentation as well. Yep.
So drive that. So standard disclaimer up front. These are my views, not of my company, my former companies, any companies I've worked for in the future. So any complaints, come to me, please. I won't preface every comment I have about, there's lots of different ways about doing this, and this may or may not be right for you. Just assume that you're gonna have to assess things in your own environment, and what I'm saying are my opinions. It will be opinionated in certain areas. If I think some practices are particularly bad, I'll call those out, but there's many different ways to slice and dice vulnerability management. And the third thing, of course, is this would be way better in person. So it's great that we've got webinars. It's great the technology's there. At some point post-COVID, particularly for the Tokyo community, I really look forward to meeting with everybody in person. The interaction is just way better. So in place of that, please, as we go along, ask questions, put them in the chat. If what I've said makes no sense, put a question mark or the emoji of the guy with his hands up, or just work out a way to communicate, and that will help me immensely to know what's working, what isn't. So that's the disclaimer. In terms of about me, I can't really add to what Stephen said. I've worked for big companies and small companies. I set up and ran my own software company for a number of years, and in fact that was at the point I became particularly interested in security, because our company was responsible for everything we did. We distributed some web-based applications through SoftBank BB, real users from corporations to parts of the Japanese government, and we didn't want to get it wrong. So that's when I became very detail orientated in the security world. Let's kick off on what I'm going to cover and not going to cover, and you'll know whether or not you want to leave or just look at the pretty pictures. This is really about vulnerability management in terms of your server fleet. So if you've got, whether it's just 10 or 20 or hundreds or thousands of servers, you're going to start wanting to patch servers at scale. It's a very different beast from patching PCs for various reasons I'll go into. Not that that's a bad thing, absolutely you should be doing those things, but I'm not going to get down into patching PCs, network devices, control systems. The tooling, I'll touch on the tooling needed for patching, but as Stephen mentioned in the introduction, this exercise is much more a logistics thing than a tooling thing. There's many different tools. You're going to have to choose a tool at some point, but I'm hoping to get a broader message across to you in terms of how to look at this in its entirety. And the final thing which deserves lots of attention, but I won't be going to this now, is application level vulnerabilities. So if you're looking at things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, this in general won't be caught by any of the patching you're doing at an OS or middleware layer. All really important stuff, but we've only got so much to go through in a presentation. But if you are responsible for security in your organization, you need to be on top of all of those areas. Right, next. So why prioritize patching? There's many different things you need to do in your day-to-day work, and it's really easy not to patch, and it's really easy to fall into the habit of assuming everything's okay, I haven't been hurt yet. You may actually understand the reason why you want to patch, but maybe your management doesn't, or you're having trouble selling the idea because there will be effort, costs, and commitment involved. So why prioritize patching? The first two really I've put up there are probably areas you're going to be discussing with your management. The first one is risk. And you may or may not have a risk function in your organization that wants to go through operational risk. IT risk and cyber risk tends to be one part of operational risk. You may have ways of representing it, or you may not, but there's a risk involved in not patching. The first two, financial and reputational, to a degree in some organizations, management will pay lip service to that. They'll compare the cost of, well, how much does it cost to set up and run and patch compared to my outlay now? Why bother? I'll just pick up the penalty later. Reputational impact, pretty much every major service that we all use day to day, major companies have been hacked and they still survive. So you could argue that the reputational impact you'll get over at some point. Of the risk areas though, operational risk I think is worth really driving home. If something goes wrong, an attacker gets into the system, the ability to actually stop your operations is real, and your company could grind to a halt, or it depends on what you're doing. If you're in a medical environment, you may end up risking people's lives, literally. So that potential operational impact is something that you're not necessarily able to recover from, and I think management needs to understand that's very real. Secondly, or lastly on that list, is regulatory. You may be able to weather a financial impact. Some of the fines for breaches have been pretty low, but the regulatory impact, if a regulator is concerned about what you do, how you operate as an organization, that can have a much more serious impact than some fines. And again, this is areas where senior management start to get into areas of personal responsibility in their duties as directors of the company.
Robin,
the other point,
quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Quick question from the audience. So they've asked, how do you prioritize and target some high-risk vulnerabilities? Because you have new vulnerabilities being discovered almost every single month, and to basically remediate all of them is quite time-consuming and expensive.
All right. Okay, let me. Fine. So there's a slide later on. It's a great question. Slide later on prioritization. But in a nutshell, I would if your vulnerability program is running well, you address all the vulnerabilities every month. And I appreciate that you may not be at that stage yet, and so I'll cover prioritization a little bit later. But it's a really good question, because ultimately, particularly when you're starting out, you're going to make choices on what you do and don't do. So I'll get into that a little bit later. But please don't think just because there's so many vulnerabilities coming out every month that it's an impossible task. It's not. I've been there. It's not. You can get on top of this. Next on the kind of the management discussion, not patching is just not defensible. Now, if there's a 0 day that comes out and you get hit, then it's a 0 day. It's not what you can do about that. But if there's in most organizations, particularly Japanese ones, there's vulnerabilities that have been around for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, which are left on systems, and it's not really defensible to say, well, I didn't patch. And again, in the Japanese context, the apology to all and sundry, if something's gone horribly wrong, it's less easy to do if you've not patched, and it's that should just be a part of your routine IT operations. The other reasons why, as a IT practitioner and a security practitioner, I think you should really have a good focus on this is as I said earlier, patching works. Secondly, if you're running a vulnerability management program, it really exposes weaknesses in other parts of your IT operations and governance, or to flip it around, it really maximizes the investment you make in those. So a solid CMDB that's up to date, the ability to recover from a system failure quickly without an issue. These types of things, it's all patching in isolation it's difficult to make it work. It's got to be coordinated with other parts of your IT function. And this is where I always emphasize, everyone I speak with, that I don't think patching is a security exercise. I think it's just IT hygiene. I've had IT roles where I was responsible, when I was at GE Capital Japan, responsible for all of the IT infrastructure, and there was no question of this being a security thing. It's just IT operations, and that mindset I think is really important to take away. And the last thing, if you're working, particularly if you're in management, working with your team, trying to motivate your team, this is just part of doing IT right. And if you've got engineers working for you who are not allowed or not able in their environment to do the right things and really participate properly in the IT world and do IT right, they're going to get really frustrated. So it's just part of the do IT right mantra, which I think is really important for motivating and retaining staff. Right, next. The sponsor for the program is incredibly important, and whether you have a formal program or not, or whether you've just got an acknowledgement that this is important, it's really important you know who is going to have your back and support you if you need to spend money, you need to get patching windows and these types of things. Ideally, the higher up the list, so CEO, CIO, but the most important thing is that the person that sponsors the vulnerability management or has real skin in the game on vulnerability management sits above the operations, IT operations, and and business applications. If it's seen as an infrastructure job, this will not end happily. You've got to, you may be in a tactical phase where it's an infra thing and infra go and patch these servers. But unless the application people are going to provide people to test applications, make patch windows available, this can't succeed. So it's absolutely critical who is the sponsor of the program. Measuring the problem is at a kind of the big picture, the macro level is very important, and this is where it comes down to vulnerability scanning. Some patching tools have vulnerability reports. My preference is to use one of the leading vulnerability scanning vendors, people like Qualys, Rapid7. They're an independent view of what your state of your infrastructure is. When you start scanning, though, be careful. Scanning is normally something that doesn't impact or affect your servers, but it can lead to problems in edge cases. So when you're scanning, be careful at first. Make sure that you look out for any kind of adverse effect. It's really important where you can to have an authenticated scan versus non-authenticated. So with an authenticated scan, the scanning engine is actually able to log into your server. The level of detail you get by doing that is far, far higher, or you may have an agent installed on the server. That's kind of the gold standard. You can do non-authenticated scanning, is what the scan engine can view just by externally visible aspects of your server. It's much more limited. It may be the starting point, but your goal should be to get to authenticated scanning. The timing and frequency of scanning is an interesting one. Normally, most people are doing it out of hours, on the weekends. All of the licensing I'm aware of for these types of products is based on the IP, not the frequency. So just scan weekly. Why wouldn't you scan weekly? As long as there's no performance impact in a window that would affect the business. So scan weekly if I were you, and even front-end servers, web-facing servers, there's an argument for scanning daily. Please, somebody tell me why you wouldn't, if there's no impact on production. You come up with a number by doing that. When you look at the vulnerability scanning, some of the vendors have a risk measure. All of them will have a metric, which is basically a list of vulnerabilities. You have a vulnerability count, and then there's going to be vulnerabilities will be categorized by normally a number of tiers, but critical is an understood term in the industry. So whether it's Qualys, I think Qualys, it's their rating of 4 and 5. Rapid7, they actually just have a label critical. Focus on the critical vulnerabilities, and a metric that I think you should measure is average number of critical vulnerabilities per server. What does good look like? If you're getting down into single digits, you're doing really well. If you're getting below 5, you're really best of breed. So the best I've been involved in, due to having a good team, not me, we got down to an average of less than 3 critical vulnerabilities per server on a server fleet around 400 to 500 servers. So it's very, very hard to get any better than that, because of as was mentioned earlier, there's new vulnerabilities coming in every month. It's a non-stop process. Once you start, if you're starting, you will find you have some servers. Most of your servers will have probably several hundred vulnerabilities, critical vulnerabilities. Some may even have as many as 1,000 critical vulnerabilities. So if you're first to doing this, don't be freaked out by some really high numbers to begin with. You just got to drive that down, and you will get there. So that's measuring the kind of the big picture. What's it look like? At a macro level, it really pays to get down into the detail. And if you're an engineer on the ground, you absolutely have no choice at all. But even if you're a manager sponsoring this program, if you're as part of the technical organization, spend a bit of time getting down into the detail of, you'll have thousands of vulnerabilities. So it's not every single one, but start to get a feel, look at the reports, look at the severity levels, read the descriptions, really start to understand what's going on. And what the potential impacts are, and then as you go through this, understand the trends that you have in your organization. Once you start patching, you're going to want to understand what the trends are and what the delta is you've had from the previous week. And that's one thing that when I was very directly involved in patching, we had pretty much, we'd look at the reports every week. We didn't have patching every weekend, but new vulnerabilities would come in. But particularly after we've done a patch cycle, absolutely laser focused on what the delta is from before, looking at servers which have a very high number of vulnerabilities. Why is that? What can we do to move that ahead? So that's again, it's detail, and at some point, once you've got this machine ticking over, you probably don't need to spend so much time on the detail. But when you're beginning this, get really down into the ugly detail. It will pay dividends in the end, because you really have to understand this. One thing that is again important in some organizations, maybe not all, is do you have a concept of risk acceptance? So if there is a particularly difficult server to patch, or vulnerability that if you patch it, the application is going to stop working, end of life servers, things like this. Do you have a risk acceptance process, and how do you manage that? What normally happens is people get targets set for number of vulnerabilities, but if there's something intransigent that you just can't get rid of, and so that your whole score doesn't get brought down, and so that the business knows what the risk is, there's normally a risk acceptance process. The bigger the organization, the more involved and functional your enterprise risk department is. That's going to become more and more important. So it may not be a thing for you now, but be aware that that concept exists in terms of overall vulnerability management programs. Right, next is the patch program roles. And this could, in a really small organization, this might be the same person. I think once you get to once you're getting into the hundreds of servers, there's going to be multiple people, many people involved, in fact, multiple people for some of these roles. First up, you're going to need somebody who's going to coordinate at the business level. Ideally, you have your patch windows, patch schedules agreed way in advance. And in fact, there's probably no reason not to have it a whole calendar year or financial year in advance. You know what the key activities are. You know when your long weekends are. If you've got something that is difficult to patch and may take a long time, you want to target it on a long weekend. Lots and lots of things to do with coordinating with the business, coordinating with the application owners. So that's very fundamental to doing this. Then there's a technical coordinator who's really facing off with the engineers and making sure the engineering team is cooking and ready to go. The engineers themselves, somebody's going to be responsible for the tools. And as I say, I'm not going to get dirty into the tools, but there's many out there. Some are dedicated, like Satellite for Red Hat. Some people use Ansible scripts and scripting and all sorts of things. That I'm not going to, I'm kind of neutral on what you do as long as it's effective in your environment. You need engineers who really understand. A lot of this is going to be on virtualized environments. The whole snapshot backup recovery process in your environment, that's just got to be down pat. You must be able to, be able to do so easily all the time, and that's pretty critical to what you're doing. Middle operating system engineers, middleware engineers, again, once you're doing patching, typically you're going to have different people involved. There's application testers at the end at the business level to make sure something's worked, and escalation points if it hasn't worked. And I've realized going through this, I missed an important quote earlier, which is if something's hard, repeat it. And that's not medical advice, or something hurts rather, repeat it. It's not medical advice. It's in things like backup and recovery and patching. If you're finding difficulty doing it, by doing it again and again, you'll automate the things that are difficult. You'll make it safer and safer to do. And this is where the people in these roles will be absolutely vital to what you're doing. They're making something that hurts and is hard in the beginning, and they're making it run like clockwork, so it's not something to be afraid of. Next, I'll get into what may or may not be the money slide for this presentation. What does a patch cycle look like? And again, by looking at this patch cycle, I hope it drives home my view that this is a logistical challenge as much as a technical challenge. First, in a small organization, you may not have a CAB, a change advisory board. Most big organizations, CAB meets every week to look at changes upcoming. With standard vulnerability management, standard patching, you may only get an appearance once a month at CAB just to say, yep, that program is ongoing, so people don't forget it. If you're doing something particularly on the more difficult end of patching, maybe you've got a complex Oracle redundant array, an Oracle rack with multiple nodes that will need to be patched node by node and that type of thing. If I was patching a large Oracle instance like that, I would definitely put that into the CAB to give a heads up to everybody involved that this is out of the ordinary what we're doing. Otherwise, regular patching is very much business as usual, but should go into the CAB at least once a month, I'd say. Assuming that's been done, we get into, on a given week, you're going to be patching and validating your patches on test servers. Normally you can do that in business hours. That's just a super easy thing to do. And again, staging servers, most people will find that access to staging servers is super easy, again, done in business hours. Really test your patches. Then once we get to, assuming that you have a weekend patch window for some production servers, 3 days in advance, you're going to need to confirm between whoever's the technical side, who's organizing the technical resource, and the business coordinator, exactly what servers are being patched and what patches you intend to apply. Get that agreed in advance. There needs to be a common understanding of exactly what you plan to do. Next, test, before you get into this whole actual patching, test your network access, test the accounts that are going to be used to actually affect the patches. If you've got an expired account, when it comes to the patch day and you can't patch, that's a disaster. Don't do that to yourself. That's an unforced error. You have to treat your patch windows like gold. You can't make more of them. So you've got to make the most of every patch window you have. Do the basics in advance. Please don't be in my organization responsible for patching and not test your accounts, because I'm not going to be a happy manager if you come back to me and say, yeah, I couldn't patch those 30 servers because it was an expired account. You also need to get confirmation. This is going to be in people's should be in people's calendars weeks and months in advance, but the day before or 2 days before, email, ping out to whoever's going to be testing from the application side, the business side, are testers lined up? Because if you can't test your servers after patching, you don't patch. You just don't do that. There's a small pause because I'm assuming there's a slight break between the lists. Once we actually get down to the day of the patching, and you might be starting late on a Friday night, it might be Saturday morning, it might be Sunday, depends on what your environment is. Confirm that there's no other business activities, and the most likely thing that would stop you from starting is either batch jobs, or if you want to actually, if you're maybe switching a web server or something to point to a maintenance page, stuff like that. Get all of that taken care of. You need to confirm any of your standard backups are in place, and you need to then take a snapshot. Assuming it's a VM, you're taking a snapshot of the server to be patched. And you're going to be doing 10s of these at a time. So it's a whole process. Automate as much as you can, but make sure you got a snapshot taken. And the snapshots are different from backups. Backups are your normal standard full backup and recovery. A snapshot is something you can roll back to very, very quickly. The bit in red there on the screen, this is why I say this is a logistical challenge. Patch server, that's the technical bit. You press the button on the tool, or you manually invoke a patch. It might be something as simple as yum update all, and off you go. So that's the patching part, and it will any given patch will either succeed or fail. So you've got to capture the output of that. You may be going through multiple reboots. If you get very sophisticated and are really tight on when your patch windows are, you may actually want to run a scan immediately after you think you've patched to check and verify if it went ahead well or not. That gets that's operating quite a high level. But yeah, patch the servers, multiple reboots involved, possibly. and report back on any errors. Now, this is the point at which the technical team, yeah, go ahead. Questions, please.
Question. Yeah, so this is really good. Like, it's a lot of detail in terms of like how much work and logistics goes into, I guess, executing on this. I guess the two questions that come up is one, like which person in the security team or IT team is responsible for organizing all these logistics? And then the second one is how do you manage exceptions where you can't properly patch a server or a service?
Okay, right. So I touched on that a little bit earlier. Anyway, in terms of who's responsible, this is IT operations. That these technical parts, I'd be surprised if the security team should be involved in any decisions about when you don't patch or have risk acceptance. So if an application team or the IT operations team says, look, that is just got to stay on Java 1.6 for the next 6 months, I'm sorry. I would want the security team to be involved in working with the infra guys to understand what the implications of that are, and put in place any other mitigations that might be needed. And that's one thing where security definitely is involved. The other place where security is involved is in helping set realistic targets for the metrics that I'm mentioning. So things like particularly the metrics of critical vulnerabilities per server, and getting support within management for doing this activity. But this is why I call this IT operations more than security. It gets banded in security because clearly there's an overlap. But in terms of people getting their hands dirty, all of the stuff on this page, I see this as being your infra team and your business application team.
So it sounds like the security team is more about the oversight and the advice.
Absolutely, it's the oversight, it's governance. So the security team, if there's a operational aspect to it, they may have some small involvement, but particularly the governance, the oversight. You may get involved if something's gone wrong on a big patch or a patch weekend or a rollback. Somebody may ask for some kind of sign off, but this is really once the program is in place and understood what you're trying to achieve, the implementation that is primarily an operations thing, the management of risk acceptance and what you don't patch and why, then the security team should be involved. Does that help?
Yeah.
Right. In the interest of time, I'll not go through all of this in detail, but just be aware that you may need to roll back. And rollback decisions get made. Once you've patched, the technical team can decide it look good. The business team needs to do their application testing. They may need a rollback. And in your patch window, you have to allow time and have it in your window so that if you do roll back, you have the opportunity to retest the application, just to make sure in this whole thing you've not broken anything. So that's this is what you should expect as the nitty-gritty. Week in, week out. You may not be patching prod every week, but depending on the size of your server fleet, you probably end up with 2 or 3 patching weekends in a month, I would guess.
There's 2 more questions, but I'll leave them to the end.
Okay, so and just very quickly, those 2 metrics on the screen there, which I think are really useful, is how many servers did you attempt to patch in any given month? I'll take a month as a patch, the overall patch cycle. How many servers did you attempt to patch? Because if you're only patching half your servers, there's a problem. And of the patching you did, what was the success rate? So again, if either of those numbers are low, your vulnerability is just going to skyrocket. Right, let's move on. Prioritization. This comes back to one of the earlier questions. If you will always at some point be making prioritizations. In terms of this is where this is maybe debatable. Some people like to prioritize on where the data's held, but typically my view is that patch as passionately as you can the internet facing servers and then work inwards. That's the most obvious point of attack. Obviously an attacker can get in your network and be in your internal network, but the obvious first place is internet facing. To patch internet facing, then the next level will be application servers, and ideally you'll set up so your internet servers and application servers are separate, and your internet servers are in a DMZ, your application servers are in the internal segment, and your application servers should be in a network segment away from data. Patch from internet out coming in. The other kind of takeaway is you should OS level and parts which don't really, OS and I'll add to this Apache Nginx, things like this, where there's no real close connection with your own application programmers. Just knock yourself out. Do that as often as you can. Keep those really, really up to date. Where you're going to have to exercise caution is where middleware is involved, so Java, WebLogic, Tomcat, anything like that, and as well with databases. There tend to be greater number of dependencies. You'll probably end up wanting to do a greater level of testing. You may not yet have the maturity of testing to be able to do those with confidence. So that's going to influence your prioritization. Definitely, I would be aiming to do those. And as part of your vulnerability management program, you're going to have some difficult conversations from time to time with application owners who don't want to go through the pain and the effort of moving up a Java level or moving up a WebLogic level. Either they don't want to do it, they don't think they've got money for the licensing or whatever it is. You're going to have some hard conversations with those, which is why you need a senior level of sponsor. But OS level and things like front-end web servers, you know, knock yourselves out. Do that as much as you can. Also, if you see that failures in patching are recurring, you've got to understand that. Work out why that's happening and try and cut that off at the pass. And then the other thing that I really, and this is where getting into the detail helps, if you look at a detailed vulnerability report, the first thing is going to jump out of you, and it will, trust me, you're going to see 3, 10, 100,000 lines, and you scan through that, and you'll be asking, why do I have Adobe Flash on this server? Why do I have Firefox browser on this server? It has nothing to do with those and aren't needed for the business application. You end up with so much cruft and nonsense on servers if you're not extremely well disciplined in your change control. If you've got software on servers that's not needed, get it off. Next, patching in Japan. This is a fun subject. So adoption in Japan tends to be very, very slow compared to everywhere else in the world. And this is a number of factors, very historical factors. The vendor influence is very, very strong, and that's coupled with that third point, management generalization. Still many Japanese companies, IT is still not very specialized, can be quite generalized, that then puts a huge dependence on the vendors. And frankly, from the management side in IT companies, it's not all the vendors' fault. We're not asking the right questions. We're not cutting contracts with vendors that include the requirement to be able to patch, to keep software at current levels and these types of things. And if you just pay the vendor on providing application software and run-of-the-mill support, that they won't patch if they're not asked. So it's the vendors are, I would say, complicit in this, but equally business side. We've just not been asking the right questions. So there's this established practice in Japan that so many people will know we don't patch. It's quite bizarre if you're used to other environments. And a degree of reliance on encrypted in Japanese. And indeed, there's been cases where people have done pen testing, got into a Japanese server, the command prompt came back in Japanese, and they just kind of gave up then. Those days are over. So my response to that, and I can tell you that it works. I've tried this, done it. There's 3 phases of patch acceptance. And I'll talk you through these really, really quickly, but I've been there. Unfortunately, you can't just jump to the end one. And in my experience, each phase takes weeks or months to work it through with many, many, many stakeholders in an organization. But the first comment I've had on at times is, Robin-san, we can't afford to do it. We don't have the money to do it. That is very much a false objection. Once you start getting into understanding where money is being spent on IT and all the rest of it, in fact, people will be able to find the money for this. I've never known that to be a real objection. but it takes a few months to work that through. Then we'll come back with the statement, well, it will break stuff. We won't be able to do business because it will break. That again is, I understand that concern, and people are very worried about that, but let me just give you the small anecdote of in my most recent history, over about 3 years patching, so few hundred servers every 3 years, around give or take 10,000 patch cycles of production servers. I had one instance where patching broke a server, and on the business day there was a very small business impact, and that was related, frankly, because the patch itself was a bad patch from Microsoft, and our testing wasn't adequate. We didn't test an edge case in our test scripts, so that could have been caught. We didn't. There was a small impact to the business, and from my experience as CTO at my previous company, we had far more outages, big and small, from other reasons. If you do patching properly and vulnerability management properly, and you test properly, and you have the ability to roll back, the impacts on business are going to be, shouldn't impact the business, or if they do, it's very limited to a small part of the user community. And then finally, you work through that about why it's not going to break everything. And finally, the response, and this is very common in Japanese companies where there's not the culture of owning and really believing in what you're doing in IT, is I don't want to be responsible. And that's the one that you've really got to crack at the end and understand. You've got somebody strong in your management team who says, yes, it is okay to do this. We'll do it in this structured fashion. And if there is a failure, it's my responsibility because this is part of the greater good. So those are the three phases of patch acceptance, particularly relevant for Japan. Let's go on. Okay, so quick one on end of life software, end of support software. I'll just run through very quickly. You can look at that later. The obvious question is plan to avoid this, don't let it happen to you, and then in the real world, we all find ourselves in a situation we've either inherited or for real reasons, we end up with some end-of-life software. And extended support may or may not help you. It can be really, really expensive. But if you buy extended support just so that you theoretically have support but are not patching and making advantage of the extended support, it's kind of meaningless. Risk, and there's a typo there. Somebody, please, if this goes onto YouTube, please put in the comments that should be risk assess, not risk access. I apologize for that. You should risk assess what's going on, and this is quite important, because if you're accepting end-of-life software in your fleet and stuff you're responsible for, whether it's you're a security person or an ops person, if you don't risk assess this is no longer BAU activity. This is an out of line situation. Make sure the business, make sure management knows the additional risks, and if somebody gets into your network and there's remote code execution that's no longer have a patch provided for by the vendor, it's a problem. This you do need to call out to your management as a minimum, or the risk department if necessary. And then mitigate. Before that software goes into life, make sure it's patched and up to date. Harden the software server as much as you can. Make sure it's in a proper network. You've got proper network segmentation. Do the monitoring, additional monitoring, and have a plan B. I won't get into the detail now. I don't have the time. But we had a situation for a while where it's a Windows 2003 server, which was end of life, and we'd accepted that and risk accepted it. For various reasons, the word came down from management. You've either got to pull it from the network in 2 weeks or replace it. So we fortunately had a plan B, and we were able to move on that. There be dragons. If you hear any of these, it should be alarm bells in your ears. Be really worried about this. If somebody says, I don't patch, but I can patch in an emergency, that's nonsense. If you haven't patched for 3 years and a WannaCry or something comes along and you try an emergency patch, you will break everything. that will be a nightmare for your ops team and nightmare for everyone. So if anybody tells you I don't patch, but I can patch in an emergency, you know they do not know of what they talk, and find somebody else who can be responsible. Likewise, if somebody says, don't worry about that Java 1.6, my vendor will support it. Vendors can't do that. That's nonsense. Not just Java, any of these end-of-life components, somebody says their vendor can support it, ain't true. Don't believe it. Only internet-facing servers need to be patched. Not true. Assume an attacker has got into your internal network by one way or another, phishing, malware, blah, blah, blah. There's something which is, this is more a jibe or a kick at some of the vendors who sell software where you get a ticket for each vulnerability, and you've got these thousands of tickets, and you assign an owner to them, and you've got this massively complex ticket management thing going on. That's not how you patch servers. You patch servers in the way I've described. You have a server based and you run it that way. That's how you get large scale patching. It's not by assigning a ticket to each vulnerability. And finally, that patch doesn't apply to me. Ultimately, at the CTO level and the head of security level, you can make that agreement. But if somebody low level in the organization or the business side is saying that patch doesn't apply to me, you know, I'll be a bit worried about that. And I think this is the final thing, last resort patching, last resort patch program. If you've got no money, no support from management, you want to do the right thing, you want to do IT right, well, what can you do? Well, find a way to scan for vulnerabilities. If you can, using one of the paid software tools, but start to understand what the problem is. Remove unneeded software. And if you remove any software, you're still going to need to test the server after it's still working, but it's hard to argue with removing unneeded software. Harden your servers. If you've got software running that doesn't need to, stop it running. If you've got ports open that don't need to, stop that. Create configuration guidelines for anything new being created going forward. Work on the adjacent areas, CMDBs, that whole backup rollback thing. Make sure you're really, really slick in those areas. Get experience either on test servers or infrastructure servers that you own. If you own, the McAfee console server, that's entirely within your remit. And even if you're patching it manually, not through a tool, get experience doing this stuff. And then, if you've got getting no support or people aren't helping you out, refer back to my 3 phases of patch acceptance. That I think is it. You can contact me on LinkedIn. That's the only social presence I have, but I'm very welcome to connect with any of you guys. If you've got questions, ship them over, can have a call, and you get bonus prize if anyone can tell me circuit diagram on the right, from what computer did that come. Get the right answer to me in the next 24 hours, 1 guess per person, not just a list of computers. I'll buy a bottle of champagne.
Well,
that's it for me.
That sounds like a very nice offer.
Let's just do the questions. What's left? I'm sorry,
Let's get into the questions. Yeah, that's a very generous offer, and thanks for sharing your expertise and lessons in patch management. A question: in the cloud environment, it's assumed that the hosts have the latest patch. However, I think we still need to do security configuration review at least, if not vulnerability scan. What's your view on this?
Okay, so absolutely. So configuration review, definitely. You should have some kind of design patterns, what are they called? The reference architectures in terms of what you're doing in the cloud, and that should include everything to do with security. One of the concerns I have, and I've heard this, is, oh, don't worry, we've got AWS and it automatically patches a Windows server. That's the scariest thing I've ever heard. You don't want to automatically patch servers without any kind of attendance, because things can break. And the last thing as a security professional I want to hear is, we patched the server, it broke it, so we're not patching it anymore. That's why, even if it's in the cloud, and even if there are automated tools that make it much easier to patch, and it's great if there are, and you just press that button, you still need professionals involved at every step of the process to ultimately, if needed, roll back to the previous state. And somebody has to make a decision, is it okay, do I need to roll back? But yeah, all of the disciplines, whether it's on-prem apply to the cloud. Hopefully in the cloud you can do way more patching. You do things much easier. It's easier to spin up test serves and test them. It's easy to do things like have extra servers in maybe your web servers. You've got multiple, where before on-prem you've only got 3, you can have 6, and you can, if you set up your load balancing right, you can actually set a certain community to be accessing the patch server for a number of days even before you put it out into the general population of your users. There's so many great things you can do in the cloud that are different. It's great, but security doesn't go away.
Got it. And do you have any recommendations for best practices in cloud environment? And let's say you have the example of a Autoscale group where the virtualized system has a very short lifespan.
All right, so Autoscale's great, and the best practices there. There's going to be loads, so I'm going to be missing tons of these, so please Google it. But I've worked with Autoscale groups; they're brilliant. The key thing is making sure that the AMI that which is the golden image that AWS or whoever it is will be generating or spawning a new server from is in the state you expect it to be, and that and patching that and keeping that up to date is a challenge. So that's one of the key things. Keep an eye, again, it's like a monitoring thing. So if auto scaling has gone out of control, I mean, you're going to put limits on it, but if you're auto scaling in a way that you wouldn't anticipate in normal operations, it might be an indicative of a problem elsewhere, somewhere else in the software stack. I was seeing on today, if you go to Hacker News today, and if you'd be able to Google it anyway, from long into the future, the Slack programming team put out a great article on a post-mortem of a failure they had. And there was a kind of cascading failures that happened. So even though it's just auto scaling on AMI, if there's odd behavior, it may be indicative of something else. So the monitoring is important, making sure the AMI images that create a new server are up to date and kept current. That's also super important. But there's, Google it, there's experts out there who know far more than me on that.
And are there any tips about container patching? You know, for example,
okay, so
packages.
Yeah, so again, I probably unreasonably, I'm not a huge fan of containers, because I think you're, I don't think you got rid of the problem. I think you've moved it, but I don't have a lot of hands-on experience. So please don't prejudge that. You're going to have to do some research. I've tended to steer clear of them, because you still need to, if you're creating a container, you're still going to need to have all of the disciplines I mentioned in the patch cycle still need to be there. Containers are great for the portability, a lot of flexibility. I personally am not a fan. That doesn't mean they're wrong or bad, but I can't offer you a lot of insight, because I've just never really been a huge fan.
Got it. What about patching in response to, patching in response to vulnerabilities? Makes sense. But what about if you've got an environment where there's no high or critical vulnerabilities? When do you think updates should be applied?
Congratulations, don't patch. Anything below unless, I mean, if you've already kind of prepaid for it with a vendor or the rest of it, in any large environment, I've not known servers without a critical vulnerability. Seriously, congratulations. Go work out what that computer is on the right. Drink the champagne I buy you. I don't look at non-critical vulnerabilities in the lists. I wouldn't put it in the metrics. They tend to get resolved as part of patching other things, because I mean, if you apply a patch, it's going to address a number of vulnerabilities, and often they're lower criticality, lower severity ones. So I would just ignore it. Congratulate yourselves. It's unlikely, but great. If that's the case, I wouldn't go out of my way to have a whole patch window just for some low severity vulnerabilities.
Sounds like an excellent position to be in. And just to summarize the presentation, what are the key takeaways you'd like people to remember from your presentation?
Key takeaways are, and you may or may not be in this position, sometimes the organization you're in is resistant to patching. It's worth, fight the good fight, guys. There are some things which are worth fighting for. You don't have to be direct or confrontational about it, but patching is something you should do. And what has to be understood is this is, although it might be maybe security is a sponsor and the CISO is a sponsor, but to make this happen, it's not a security activity. It's an operational activity. IT operations, pulling in the business applications. You've got to get everybody on board. And then the final thing I'd say is don't despair. If you're in an environment where it's not receptive to a full-blown vulnerability management program, you're really driving the numbers down. There's a lot you can do. You can do skunk works remediation of stuff that you've got control over. You can work on just removing software and getting buy-in for that. You can work on configuration specifications and reference architectures for new stuff coming on board. Keep preaching it. Don't get disheartened if you get pushbacks. I've been there, but you'll get through it.
That's great advice. And I think if anyone's in that situation, feel free to reach out to me. I can connect you with other people who might be able to share their experience as well, such as Robin, or I could post up your questions on LinkedIn as an anonymous post and get people to share their ideas and inputs.
And if you just want sympathy for me to tell you that really sucks, just contact me and I'll tell you, that really sucks, man. Sorry. I feel bad for you.
Sometimes that's needed in this situation. So if you can move to just the one last slide, just one last message for everyone.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, they're very important. Yeah, absolutely. I'm really looking forward to this.
So thank you so much again, Robin, for sharing your expertise. I just wanted to share the next webinar that we have up, episode 5, Managing Cloud Security with Identity Access Management and Infrastructure as a Code. It's a hot topic. A lot of you guys have asked for more webinars around cloud security. Here it is. It's with our good friend Eric Evans. Please register in the same link that was sent before for registering for this webinar, and hope to see you there. Thanks again, Robin, for your time. If people have questions and want access to the slides,
just reach out. Yeah, reach out, please do, guys. And as I say, 24 hours from now, if you can tell me what computer that circuit diagram's from, first person gets a bottle of champagne.
Perfect. Sounds good. Submit your guesses, guys, and I'll see you in the next webinar. Take care.
Cheers, guys. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.